Kofi's life was simple but full of quiet contentment. The village where he lived was small, nestled in the heart of Ghana, surrounded by arid land that only grudgingly yielded crops. Each morning he rose before the sun, feeling the rough texture of the earth under his bare feet as he walked to the fields. His hands were calloused from years of working the land, but the sight of his modest crops sprouting from the soil brought him a sense of pride and fulfillment that no wealth could replace. His home, a small clay hut with a thatched roof, was the center of his world. Inside, his wife prepared meals over an open fire, while their daughter, Adwoa, played nearby, her laughter a melody that made the daily toil worthwhile. Despite the poverty that surrounded them, Kofi's heart was rich with love and gratitude. He cherished these moments, the quiet mornings, the simple meals, and the bond he shared with his family. To him, these were the true treasures of life. But before we dive deeper into this tale, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next exciting chapter. The village, however, was a place of stark contrasts. The wealthier families lived in larger, sturdier homes, with fields that yielded more than enough to keep them comfortable. Kofi often saw them from a distance, their children dressed in finer clothes, their wives adorned with jewelry that sparkled in the sun. Yet he held no envy in his heart. He believed that a man's worth was not measured by his wealth, but by the love he gave and the integrity he maintained. But this belief would soon be tested in ways Kofi could never have imagined. The village feast was an event everyone looked forward to, a rare occasion when the entire community gathered to celebrate the harvest. Kofi, like every year, attended with his family. They arrived early, hoping to find a good spot among the rows of makeshift tables set up in the village square. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meat and freshly baked bread, and the sound of drums echoed through the night. As the evening wore on, Kofi noticed how his old friends, those who had once shared his humble beginnings, now mingled with the wealthier villagers, their laughter loud and careless. They had risen in status, some through trade, others through marriage, and had long left Kofi behind. He felt their eyes on him, not with the warmth of old companionship, but with a cold detachment that stung more than he cared to admit. When the village chief Nana Kwame arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Everyone turned their attention to him, a man whose wealth and influence commanded respect. It was then that one of Kofi's former friends, now a prosperous trader, approached him. With a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he handed Kofi a serving tray. "Why don't you help out? It's the least you can do," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. The words cut deep, but Kofi, ever humble, accepted the tray without protest. He walked through the crowd, serving those who had once been his equals, now feeling the weight of their disdainful gazes. As he served, he overheard snippets of conversation, mocking words about his tattered clothes, his simple life. The humiliation was like a thorn in his side, but he pressed on, determined not to let their scorn break his spirit. Yet, as the night wore on, the sting of betrayal by those he once called friends lingered. He couldn't help but wonder if his principles, his belief in the value of a simple, honest life, were worth the price of such humiliation. Little did he know, this night would be the turning point that would lead him down a path filled with temptation and moral peril. The days following the feast were filled with a heavy silence. Kofi went about his usual tasks in the field, but the sting of the feast lingered, gnawing at his spirit. His mind replayed the sneers and whispers, the cold indifference of those who had once been his closest companions. Though he tried to bury the feelings of shame and hurt beneath his work, they clung to him like a shadow. One afternoon, as he was tending to his crops, he noticed a figure approaching from the distance. As the figure came closer, Kofi recognized Nana Kwame, the village chief, walking toward him with a purposeful stride. Kofi straightened, wiping his hands on his worn trousers, wondering what could have brought the chief to his humble farm. "Kofi," Nana Kwame began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "I've heard about the incident at the feast. It's a shame how they treated you. You deserve better." Kofi nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. The chief rarely interacted with him, and there was an unsettling intensity in his eyes that made Kofi uneasy. "I've been thinking," Nana Kwame continued, "about how a man like you, so diligent and hardworking, could benefit from an opportunity. You see, there's a way for you to rise above this life of toil, a way to gain wealth, respect, and all the things those men have, and more." Kofi's heart quickened. He had never aspired to wealth, but the idea of being respected, of no longer being looked down upon, was undeniably tempting. "What do you mean, Nana Kwame?" he asked cautiously. "There is a ritual," the chief explained, lowering his voice as if revealing a great secret. "It is not spoken of openly, but it is known to a few. Through this ritual, you can gain what you lack, but it requires a deep commitment and a willingness to make difficult sacrifices." Ah, Kofi felt a chill run down his spine. The word sacrifice echoed in his mind, and he knew this was no ordinary proposition. "What kind of sacrifices?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nana Kwame smiled, a thin, almost predatory smile. "That is for you to discover, should you choose to pursue this path. I can arrange for you to meet with the one who can guide you, an old wise man who lives deep in the forest. But be warned, Kofi, this is not a decision to be taken lightly." Ah! Kofi's heart pounded in his chest as he considered the offer. The humiliation of the feast, the longing for respect, and the fear of continuing a life of endless toil all warred within him. He knew that agreeing would mean stepping into a world far removed from the simple, honest life he had always known. Yet, the temptation was strong, and the promise of a better life for his family even stronger. "I need time to think," Kofi said finally, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "Take all the time you need," Nana Kwame replied, his gaze piercing. "But remember, opportunities like this do not come often." As the chief walked away, Kofi stood in the field, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. That night, Kofi lay awake in his small, dimly lit hut, the words of Nana Kwame echoing in his mind. His wife lay beside him, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the turmoil within him. Adwoa, their daughter, slept in a corner, her small body curled up in a blanket. The sight of her innocent face, so calm and untroubled, filled Kofi with a deep sense of love and protectiveness. How could he even consider a path that might put her or his family in danger? But then the memories of the feast returned. Those looks of disdain, the whispered insults, the feeling of being less than a man in the eyes of his peers. He had worked so hard all his life, and yet he remained at the bottom, his dignity stripped away by those who had once been his equals. The thought of continuing in this way, of enduring more years of hard labor only to be treated with contempt, was unbearable. As the night wore on, Kofi turned the possibilities over in his mind. The idea of the ritual frightened him, but the promise of what it could bring was undeniably alluring. He imagined his family living in a better home, wearing finer clothes and being respected by those who now scorned them. Was it not his duty to provide the best life possible for his wife and daughter? Could he really turn down an opportunity to lift them out of poverty? Yet there was something dark and foreboding about the ritual. Something that made Kofi's blood run cold whenever he thought of it. He had always believed in the power of hard work and honesty, values his father had instilled in him from a young age. But now those values seemed inadequate, insufficient to protect his family from the harshness of the world. As dawn began to break, Kofi made a decision. He could not let fear hold him back from providing for his family. He would meet with the old wise man in the forest, but he would approach the ritual with caution, ensuring that no harm would come to those he loved. He could not ignore the opportunity, but he would tread carefully, seeking to understand fully what he was getting into. With this resolve, Kofi rose from his bed and stepped outside, the cool morning air calming his troubled mind. He looked out at the horizon where the first light of day was beginning to emerge. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it for the sake of his family, hoping that his choices would lead them to a better future. The day arrived when Kofi knew he could delay no longer. The burden of his decision had grown too heavy to carry in silence. He had told no one, not even his wife, about Nana Kwame's offer, but the weight of it pressed on him with every passing hour. That morning, he left the hut before dawn, telling his wife only that he needed to visit the forest for a matter of great importance. The path to the forest was long and winding, cutting through fields and groves, leading deeper into the dense, shadowy heart of the land. The closer Kofi got, the more he felt an eerie stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He knew that what awaited him was far beyond the world he had known, a world of spirits, rituals, and ancient secrets. Finally, he reached the edge of the forest. The trees loomed tall and dark, their thick branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. Kofi hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest had always been a place of mystery and fear, where only the brave or the desperate ventured. But he had made his decision. and there was no turning back. He entered the forest, the canopy above blocking out much of the daylight. The air grew cooler and the sounds of the village faded into an oppressive silence. Kofi followed the narrow path that twisted deeper into the woods, his steps slow and deliberate. He could feel the presence of something ancient, something that watched him from the shadows. After what felt like hours, Kofi reached a small clearing where a lone figure stood waiting. The old wise man was exactly as Nana Kwame had described, tall and gaunt with a face etched by time and wisdom. He wore a long robe made of animal skins, and his eyes, deep-set and piercing, seemed to see right through Kofi. "You have come," the old man said, his voice a low rasp. "Do you understand the path you are about to walk?" Kofi swallowed hard, his mouth dry. I wish to know more. I want to provide for my family, to give them a better life. But I need to understand what is required of me." The old man nodded slowly. "The ritual is powerful, and it can indeed bring you what you seek. But it demands a sacrifice, something precious, something irreplaceable. Are you willing to give up what you hold most dear?" Kofi's heart sank. He had feared as much, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality inescapable. "What must I sacrifice?" he asked, his voice trembling. The old man fixed Kofi with a long, penetrating gaze before speaking. "You must sacrifice the life of your daughter, Adwoa, to appease the spirits and gain their favor." Kofi staggered backward, the words striking him like a physical blow. The ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, and for a moment he thought he might collapse. His beloved Adwoa, the light of his life, the child he had sworn to protect. How could he even consider such a thing? No, I can't, I won't," Kofi stammered, shaking his head in disbelief. The old man remained impassive. "This is the cost. It is not a decision to be made lightly, but know that without sacrifice there can be no gain. The choice is yours." "Bull!" Kofi felt tears welling up in his eyes, his mind reeling with horror and despair. He had come seeking a way out of poverty, but now he faced a decision far more terrible than any hardship he had ever known. The thought of losing Adwoa was unbearable. Yet the fear of condemning his family to a life of endless suffering gnawed at him with relentless intensity. He stood there in the clearing, torn between love and desperation, knowing that whatever choice he made would forever change his life. Days passed in a blur of agony for Kofi. The decision he faced weighed on him like a crushing burden, suffocating his every thought. He avoided his family, unable to meet their eyes, unable to speak of the torment that twisted his soul. His wife, sensing his distress, grew increasingly concerned, but he could not bring himself to confide in her. How could he share with her the monstrous choice that haunted him? As the fateful day approached, Kofi's resolve crumbled and rebuilt itself 1,000 times over. He had always been a man of principle, a man who believed in the sanctity of life and the importance of family. Yet, the relentless voice of despair whispered in his ear, urging him to consider the unthinkable. Could he really sacrifice his own daughter to secure a future for his family? Or was it better to live in poverty with his loved ones intact? Finally, the day arrived when Kofi could delay no longer. The old man had warned him that the ritual could not be postponed indefinitely. The spirits were impatient, and their favor fleeting. Kofi knew what he had to do, even as his heart screamed in protest. He prepared himself as best he could, numbing his mind to the horror of what lay ahead. That evening, he told his wife that he needed to take Adwoa to the forest. He explained that it was a special ritual, one that would bring blessings upon their family. His wife, though wary, trusted him, and did not question further. She kissed Adwoa on the forehead, smiling as she sent them on their way, unaware of the true nature of Kofi's plan. As they walked to the forest, Kofi held Adwoa's hand tightly, his heart breaking with each step. She was cheerful, skipping along beside him, asking innocent questions about the ritual. Kofi could barely respond, his throat constricted with grief and guilt. How could he be leading his daughter to her doom? They reached the clearing, where the old man awaited them. The tools of the ritual laid out before him, an ancient knife, a bowl, and a small fire that flickered ominously in the growing darkness. The old man said nothing as Kofi and Adwoa approached, his eyes fixed on the child with a cold, appraising gaze. Kofi's hands shook as he took the knife, the weight of it foreign and terrifying in his grasp. He knelt before Adwoa, his vision blurred by tears. "Papa, what are we doing?" Adwoa asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Kofi couldn't answer. He could only look at her, this innocent child who trusted him completely, and feel his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. The old man began chanting, his voice low and rhythmic, a sound that seemed to pull the very life out of the air. Kofi raised the knife, his hands trembling uncontrollably. At that moment, as he stood on the brink of committing the ultimate betrayal, a voice rang out through the forest, a desperate, anguished cry. "Kofi, stop!" His wife burst into the clearing, her face pale and stricken with horror. She ran to Adwa, pulling her close, shielding her from the scene. "What are you doing?" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "How could you even think of this?" Kofi dropped the knife, his strength leaving him in a rush. He fell to his knees, sobbing, the reality of what he had almost done crashing down upon him. His wife's arrival had saved Adwoa, had saved him from the darkness that had consumed him. The old man watched impassively, his chant fading into silence. "You have chosen," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. "The ritual is ended." Kofi could not look at him. He could only cling to his wife and daughter, his heart heavy with guilt and shame. He had come so close to losing everything. And now, though he had not gone through with the ritual, the weight of his near betrayal would haunt him for the rest of his days. Word of what had transpired in the forest spread quickly through the village. By morning, Kofi knew that the elders would call him to answer for his actions. His wife had said nothing to him after they returned home, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She took Adwa into their hut, leaving Kofi alone outside, staring into the night, burdened by the weight of his near unforgivable deed. The following day, as the sun climbed high into the sky, a messenger from the village elders arrived. Kofi was to appear before them at once. He walked through the village in silence, the eyes of the other villagers upon him, their expressions a blend of curiosity, judgment, and fear. They knew something dark had occurred, though the full extent of it remained a secret shared only by a few. When Kofi reached the elders' council, he found Nanakwame seated among them, his face stern and unreadable. The old wise man from the forest was there too, standing silently in the corner, his presence a reminder of the dark path Kofi had almost taken. The chief elder, a man of great age and wisdom, beckoned Kofi to step forward. "Kofi," the elder began, his voice heavy with authority, "you have been brought before us to explain the events of last night. We have heard disturbing accounts and we seek the truth. What led you to the forest and what were your intentions?" Kofi took a deep breath, the weight of his guilt almost too much to bear. He knew there was no point in lying, the truth would come out, one way or another. With his voice trembling, he recounted the events leading up to that night. He spoke of his humiliation at the feast, the temptation of Nanakwame's offer, and the overwhelming fear of poverty that had driven him to consider the unthinkable. He told them of the old man's demand for Adwoa's life, and how, at the last moment, he had been saved by his wife's intervention. When he finished, the council chamber was silent. The elders exchanged glances, their faces grave. Kofi stood there, waiting for their judgment, knowing that whatever they decided, he could never undo the pain he had caused. Nanakwame was the first to speak. "Kofi has committed a grave sin, a betrayal not only of his family but of the values we hold dear in this village. He allowed greed and fear to cloud his judgment, and for that, there must be consequences." The chief elder nodded in agreement. Indeed, the spirits demand justice. But Kofi did not complete the ritual. His heart was not fully turned to darkness, and for that, there may yet be redemption. Another elder spoke up, his voice stern. "Kofi, your actions cannot go unpunished. You endangered your own child, and such a transgression must be met with a penalty. However, we recognize that you were led astray by fear and the promises of those who should have known better." "She?" Kofi's heart pounded as he awaited their verdict. He knew he deserved whatever punishment they deemed fit, but the uncertainty of his fate gnawed at him. After a long pause, the chief elder spoke again. "Kofi, you will not be cast out of the village, but you will no longer live among us as you once did. You are hereby sentenced to live in isolation, far from the village where you will have time to reflect on your actions. Your family may visit you, but you will no longer be a part of our daily lives." Kofi bowed his head in acceptance. The punishment was harsh, but he knew it could have been worse. He had been spared the ultimate price, but the cost was still great. He would live out his days in solitude, his only company the memories of what he had almost lost. The council dismissed him, and as Kofi left the chamber, he felt the weight of his sentence settle heavily upon him. He had sought to escape poverty, but in the process, he had nearly destroyed the very things that made his life worth living. Kofi's new life in isolation began the next day. He was given a small plot of land on the outskirts of the village, far from the homes and fields where he had once worked. The hut they provided him was simple, barely more than a shelter, but it was enough for a man who had been stripped of almost everything. He spent his days working the land, the solitude giving him ample time to reflect on his choices and the path that had led him here. In the quiet of the early mornings and the stillness of the nights, Kofi replayed the events over and over in his mind. He had been driven by fear and desperation, by the desire to provide a better life for his family. But in doing so, he had almost sacrificed the very thing that mattered most. The love of his daughter, the bond with his wife. These were the true treasures he had nearly lost in his blind pursuit of wealth. His wife visited him regularly, bringing Adwoa with her. The visits were bittersweet. Kofi cherished every moment he spent with them, but each goodbye was a painful reminder of the life he had forfeited. Adwoa, too young to fully understand what had happened, still loved her father unconditionally, her innocence a balm to his wounded soul. But Kofi could see the sadness in his wife's eyes, the strain that their separation had placed on her. It was a burden he wished he could lift, but he knew that some wounds could not be easily healed. As the months passed, Kofi began to find a measure of peace in his isolation. He took solace in the rhythm of the seasons, the growth of the crops, and the simple tasks that filled his days. He had nothing to distract him from his thoughts, and in that quiet, he began to understand the deeper lesson of his experience. True wealth was not found in gold or land, but in the love of one's family and the integrity of one's soul. He had been willing to trade those precious things for a fleeting promise of prosperity, and he had nearly lost everything in the process. One day, as he worked in his small field, Kofi felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The burden of his guilt, while still present, had lessened. He had faced his darkest moment and had come through it with a deeper understanding of himself and what truly mattered. He knew that his life would never be the same, but he also knew that he had been given a second chance, a chance to live with the knowledge of his mistakes and to cherish the things he had nearly thrown away. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Kofi sat outside his hut, watching the sky turn shades of orange and red. His thoughts turned to his family, to the life they would continue to build without him in the center of it. He hoped that they would find peace and happiness, even as he remained on the outskirts of their world. For the first time in a long while, Kofi allowed himself to smile. He had been brought low, but he had not been broken. He had learned that the true measure of a man was not in his wealth, but in the strength of his heart and the love he held for those closest to him. And in that knowledge, Kofi found a quiet, enduring peace. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next exciting chapter.